Well, good evening. Welcome everybody to Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Monday night seminar for this evening. This is a historic evening for the Monday night seminar series because we are live streaming tonight. So you are all going to be live streamed. Be careful what you say during question answer to members and friends all around the world who can see this on the web tonight. And because we're live streaming, we're sort of on a schedule. We're not going to spend a lot of time, as we sometimes do, talking about local bird sightings. But I will encourage everybody, if you don't already do it, to check the eBird website, ebird.org. We're still in the peak of fall migration right now. A lot of raptors are coming over. A lot of fall warblers still around. This beautiful weather is a great time to get out and see fall migrants. And if you're curious what's been seen, you can check the eBird site to see what's around. So my name is Ken Rosenberg. I'm in the Conservation Science program here at the lab. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to give a reminder for next week's Monday night seminar. We have another great seminar, assuming this one's going to be great. Dr. Scott Robinson from the University of Florida at Gainesville, an old friend of a lot of us here at the lab, will be coming up to speak on When Urban Winners Become Losers, Bird Communities in Human-Dominated Landscapes. So that will be next week's seminar. So to get right to it, it's my pleasure to introduce Grant Ballard from Point Blue Conservation Science in California. And for those of you who've been into birds for quite a while, you might recognize this organization as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, or PRBO. And so both Grant and his organization have gone through a sort of evolution over the years, and Point Blue has expanded its mission well beyond birds, and it's a wonderful organization, and we're very happy to have Grant here. Steve Kelling, our information science director, was supposed to host tonight, and Steve invited Grant all the way here from California, apparently to move a very large rock in Steve's garden, and they spent about 2 hours moving that rock yesterday, and so that's why Steve's not here today. But we're lucky that Grant is. So Grant is the Chief Science Officer right now at Point Blue. Grant was actually a Cornellian. He was here as an English major in the 1980s, and he didn't really get into birds until he went back out to California, maybe for the first time in 1991, to volunteer at Point Reyes. And he's been there ever since and has worked a lot of different jobs on different projects having to do with ecology and bioinformatics from Alaska all the way to Antarctica, and worked his way up to now being basically in charge of all the science activities at Point Blue with a staff of 70 scientists there. And Grant and Point Blue have a long history of collaboration with us here at the Cornell Lab. And of special note, Grant was a co-PI with Steve Kelling, which is the real reason he invited him here, on a very ambitious project called the Avian Knowledge Network, which is a big project, an effort to bring together all of the bird monitoring information from throughout the hemisphere into one system and one data management system, which has been a great boon to bird conservation. And Grant created the California Avian Data Center out at Point Blue, which is one of the lead portions of the Avian Knowledge Network, and Grant's now taking the lead on working with the entire Avian Knowledge Network. But Grant's first love now is Antarctica and penguins, and what this unique ecosystem can teach us about climate change. Grant's been in charge of Point Blue's Antarctica program since 2007, and along the way he got himself a PhD at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And that's the work that Grant will be telling us about this evening. So welcome.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken, and thanks to Steve for inviting me out here, and thanks to all of you. It's great to see so many people here tonight. It's definitely an honor to be here in this room and at the lab. It's one of my favorite places in the world, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk about a project that's pretty close to my heart, as Ken was saying, really focusing on trying to establish a very large marine protected area in the Southern Ocean, in this area called the Ross Sea. How many of you have heard of the Ross Sea before tonight? Oh, wow, so you know what you're doing here. That's great. Well, thank you for coming anyway. It's great. And how many of you have been to Antarctica? One? All right. Okay, well, I encourage you all to go. It's a kind of an expensive trip, but it's well worth it. All right, so to acknowledge my co-authors, Dennis Jongsomjet, Sam Velos, and David Ainley. And the four of us really have been working on this, this stuff that we're going to talk about tonight pretty closely. David, in particular, has been going down to Antarctica since 1971 and taught me everything I know about penguins. So just a little bit about Point Blue. Our mission actually hasn't changed since we were Point Reyes Bird Observatory, at least in the last 20 or 30 years. When we were originally founded in 1965 in Point Reyes, our mission was literally to observe the birds of Point Reyes, to help the National Park Service interpret the bird observations and the migration of birds to visitors to the newly established park. And we've had an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with them, a partnership with them since then. And so we still do that work, and we will still do that as long as we exist. Birds are still very much at the core of our organization. We've grown to over 140 staff, including about 70 full-time scientists. And our budget this year is about $10.2 million. And we do work mostly in California in terms of people on the ground doing stuff and out in the ocean in the California current. But we also do work in Antarctica since 1971. As well as along the entire Pacific Flyway from Alaska to Chile, mostly on shorebirds. So about the study that I'm going to be talking about, it's part of a larger program that we've been working on since 1996. And you can read more about the whole project at penguinscience.com. And generally, the idea is that we're looking at these sort of fundamental questions in ecology. Why do animals live where they live? What is their ecological niche? These are questions that have gone on in ecology since the foundation of ecology, really going back to the late 18th century. And unfortunately, our ability to understand why animals live where they live and why they occur in the numbers that they occur is greatly hampered by the fact that humans have pretty much altered every system on the planet, as you can imagine. So when we ask why do so many birds live in a certain place or so few in another place, the first answer is usually because we did something about it these days. Antarctica kind of serves as a lab in that sense, where humans really haven't been messing around too much with the system. It's also, I think, really a cool sort of example of Aldo Leopold's base datum of normality concept. Basically a place where you can go and see how things are supposed to work without human involvement. And in a sense, it teaches us about ourselves, which I think is a key concept in conservation. What is important about wilderness? It's that idea that you can find humanity in it because you can see how we interact with it. But you have to understand what it is without us to understand what it is with us. So what is, driving conservation is really this idea that we have this influence on the environment and we are part of it. But as we exist in it, our understanding of it tends to shift. The baseline shifts. This base datum of normality is always moving. We get used to what we observe. Scientists are particularly bad at this. We kind of have our blinders on. We tend to look in 4-year cycles or grant cycles and things like that. So we get used to things being a certain way, like the way they were when we were a grad student maybe, or something like that. And then we sort of forget to tell the story that we heard somebody's grandfather or something tell us about the fish that you could walk across the rivers on their backs, or the sky being darkened by millions of birds or something like that. And ecosystems tend to degrade over time. that's the general sort of story. Antarctica is still a very pristine place, and this is the part of Antarctica that I've been working in since 1996. It's called the Ross Sea, and you all know about it already, so that's really great. South of New Zealand. Takes about 7 hours to fly there from Christchurch. We fly on military aircraft. It's a pretty miserable flight, but it's not as bad as crossing it on a boat. So, although I would actually appreciate the opportunity to go birding from New Zealand to the Ross Sea, I've never gotten to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the features of this place. For one thing, and one of the things that I find the most remarkable about it, is that it has this incredible bloom of primary productivity, sort of like the grass growing and the leaves coming out in the spring in temperate latitudes. In the Southern Ocean, the equivalent of that is the primary production or productivity, which you can sense from space with sensors that can pick up chlorophyll in the ocean. And this is driven primarily by diatoms, or single-celled phytoplankton, these little bits of algae. And there's just billions and billions of tons of this stuff in the Southern Ocean, and you can see it from space. And the Ross Sea has the largest, most concentrated bloom probably in the world, certainly in the Southern Ocean. It's 28% of the total primary production of the Southern Ocean, and 12% of the entire global ocean production, which translates to a huge amount of carbon sequestration. So there's this link between global warming and the carbon content of our atmosphere and what's going on in the Ross Sea. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that might actually be an ecological phenomenon driven by top predators. So this image is the same area, but a satellite image, visual image, showing different kinds of ice. And I'm just going to highlight a few features here. This is Ross Island here in the corner. And that's actually where I do most of my work on the Adele penguins, and a little bit on emperor penguins, a little bit on killer whales there. The ocean is black in this image. This is called a polynya, the Ross Sea polynya. And polynya is a Russian word which means open water surrounded by ice. And polynyas are extremely important in the polar oceans because that's where most of the life is. And they're generated mostly, but not entirely, by wind. In this case, it's almost entirely wind-driven. And that it acts as basically a giant sea ice generator. The wind keeps blowing across this and bringing fresh water towards the surface, or not fresh, but salty, but fresher than the salty prevalent water. And it freezes, and then it blows out to sea. And it kind of forms a conveyor belt of sea ice, of pack ice. So in this picture, there's actually 3 kinds of ice. Most of the ice in the picture, all this white stuff around the polynya, is called pack ice. And that's frozen ocean that's not attached to land. Along the edge of the Ross Sea, along this area, this is called Victoria Land, this coastline. And this is fast ice, which is also frozen ocean, but it's attached to land. It's fast to land. So fast ice and pack ice are very different from each other from the perspective of a penguin, for example, or a whale. But they're both frozen ocean. Then at the bottom of the image and all across the landforms is glacial ice, which is fresh water. And that's the stuff, if that melts, it raises sea level. If all of the ice in Antarctica melts, it raises sea level something like 250 feet globally. The Ross Ice Shelf is the largest glacier in the world. It's part of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Okay, so a different look at it. This is looking at the bathymetric features of the Ross Sea. Again, Ross Island is here in the lower left. And it's another kind of amazing thing about this place. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, oceanic shelf systems in the world. It's a very extensive, relatively shallow water area. That's all this orange and red area. Going out about 500 kilometers from the Ross Ice Shelf, a little further in some places. And then there's this bank, this steep drop off to the deep water out here. There's troughs, and this is all formed by glacial scouring, these deep troughs. So even though it's a shelf system, it's still 1,000 feet deep in some places. So it's pretty deep for a shelf, but it's still a shelf system. So we'll talk a little bit about the way this system works to sort of promote the rich biodiversity of the area. Another thing that's happening in the Ross Sea is that the sea ice season, which is the time, the winter time, when the sea ice field is growing in extent. Antarctica basically doubles in size every winter because of the frozen ocean effect. The Ross Sea is the only place on the planet where the sea ice season is actually getting longer, and the sea ice is more prevalent than it has ever been during recorded time. In the last 30 years, it's extended by something like 90 days, maybe even 100 days. That's this incredible change in the timing of everything in that system. Everything is cued to what happens with the sea ice. It's kind of like spring bloom here. And imagine if that timing changed by 3 months in 30 years. We get excited when we study shorebirds and swallows and things like that when the timing of their arrival changes by a week in 50 years. This is a change of 3 months in 30 years. This is one of the biggest changes that's happening on the planet. Unfortunately, it's the opposite change from what's happening at the North Pole and the Arctic, as well as at the Antarctic Peninsula, where the sea ice field is reduced and the time of growth of that period of that sea ice is reduced by about the same amount. So really big changes in recent times, all related to, of course, to global climate change. Another study came out a few years ago by a guy named Ben Halpern, who was trying to figure out where on Earth the best places to go scuba diving are and still have a chance of seeing the full complement of biodiversity. And they got into a bit of a quarrel at a pub, apparently, or something like that, and said they made a bet that they could figure it out and come up with a science paper about it. I think it ended up in Nature, actually. But anyway, they found out that, of course, the North Sea, where they were hanging out, was the worst place in the world to go scuba diving, along with places in sort of along Southeast Asia, where there's been a lot of overfishing and a lot of coral reef bleaching and things like that. Long story short, Ross Sea, without us paying them off or anything, turned out to be the #1 place in the world, although you need a special kind of wetsuit. It's like actually a dry suit. So I'm going to introduce the cast of characters that we are working on, and I'll give you a bit more on Adele penguins, which are the sort of closest to my heart. But these are Adele penguins. There's 3 million or so of them in the Ross Sea, and it's about 38% of the global population. And I'm going to talk about what these animals eat. We'll talk about where they live and how much they dive. But the main thing to remember are these two things, krill and silverfish. You're going to hear a lot about krill and silverfish in a little bit. But that's mostly what they eat. And I'm going to switch over to a video now just to further introduce the Adeles. So they get really territorial in the beginning of the season. They set up these territories that are exactly spaced so that they can stay out of pecking range of each other, basically. And once they're all set up on their subcolonies, and subcolonies are groups of about 200 pairs or so that are within the larger groups of up to 500,000. And this is a female carrying a rock back to her mate. And she was on her way out to sea, but she just happened upon the perfect pebble. So she brought it all the way back, and then they do a little head wave, and he says, yeah, but aren't you supposed to be out getting some food now? So they head out, and they're all dirty when they're heading out. So you can always tell this is a way to cheat on the BBC videos and stuff, which way the penguins are going. Are they going out or in? And the ones going out are dirty. And most of the ones in the BBC video, no matter which direction they say they're heading, are clean. And they can toboggan like that if they get some downhill. Sometimes they come back and they find somebody unexpected on their nest, and so they have to chase them off. There's a lot of fighting, and they have to chase off the skuas, which can pull the chicks out of their nest, but they're pretty good at chasing them off. Around December 10th every year, they start hatching. And really, within a couple days, they look like that. They're about 100 grams when they come out. And they put on about 100 grams a day. So after a couple days, they look like that, and they kind of get more and more floppy and cute for quite a while. Adelies are kind of unusual in that they have often 2 chicks like that. They get to that size and the parents say, okay, you've had enough. We're going to go off. Well, actually, we need to get more for you. So both parents are now out getting food, and those are called creshed chicks. And then they get big enough that they can actually chase their parents off, and that chick may never see its parent again. They're done at that point. And once they're at sea, their world changes completely. They are truly aquatic. They have to deal with all kinds of stuff, including leopard seals. And leopard seals kind of stake out that ice foot where the penguins are trying to jump out of the water. Sometimes they hit the ice and fall back in, and the leopard seal grabs them. But the leopard seals really only have a window of opportunity that lasts about 2 weeks a year, where the Adelies are really at risk. They're extremely buoyant, and they can really fly out of the water. Sometimes they overjudge it. They kind of go too far. And they deal with such a variety of landscapes. It's amazing to think about how they navigate across these different terrains. They can go out on a foraging trip that'll last a couple days, and the ocean will be frozen, and when they come back, there'll be waves that they have to contend with. So they have to deal with getting beat across the rocks like that. But they never seem to have any problems with it. They're incredibly tough. It's really actually inspirational to watch them cope with this environment. In this situation, we have really thin ice that they hate to cross that because they're not sure if it'll hold them or not. And they do fall and slip on the ice. The ice is very slippery. Some ice is slipperier than others. So I sat here and filmed for hours, and most of them fell. And then I got kind of lucky because this emperor penguin came along, and he had a full belly, and he tried to do the same thing. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay. So about those emperor penguins. There are 200,000 of them or so in the Ross Sea, and they are the only bird in the world that, anyone fill in the blank there, never has to touch land because they nest on sea ice, frozen ocean. So they do walk around on land sometimes, and we see them up there, but mostly they're truly aquatic. Their main prey is silverfish. They'll eat squid as well. They're the diving champions of the world, really, but of the bird world for sure, diving up to 800 meters. Weddell seals are kind of like the emperor penguins of sea ice, of the seal world. They live entirely on sea ice, and they require sea ice to raise their pups on. So they're dependent, sort of like polar bears are in the Arctic. Antarctic minke whales is a special subspecies of minke whale. There's about 21,000 of them in the Ross Sea. And their main prey, just like the Adelies, are krill and silverfish. And it's incredible to think that a minke whale, which is often 30 feet long or even a little bit longer than that, has basically the same foraging niche as the Adelie penguins do. It's incredible to me that they don't actually dive very much deeper than Adelies. And often they forage at exactly the same depth. The Ross Sea killer whale is a fairly newly described killer whale. And if you don't know about killer whales, there's interesting things about their eye patches to watch out. So as you start seeing new pictures of killer whales, keep an eye on the variety of eye patch styles. They have other differences, but that's one of the dead giveaways. And the Ross Sea killer whale has one of the thinnest and most oblique angled eye patches. They tend to be very small. They're the smallest killer whale that we know of. And they seem to specialize on Antarctic toothfish, which I'll talk about in a minute. In this picture, sorry it's a little dark, but it's the only picture I have of a killer whale actually eating a toothfish. And there's actually about 4 or 5 other killer whales looking at this one. And we're not sure why they do that, but they seem to pass the fish around and sort of, socialize a little bit with the fish. So it's fascinating. We're just beginning to learn some of the secrets of these guys. These turn out to be the deepest diving killer whales that we know of for some reason, possibly because the toothfish is such a deep dwelling fish. We also just learned that they do these really long migrations. So they're really resident to the Ross Sea for most of the summertime. And then they take off and beeline it up for about the latitude of the North Island of New Zealand. It's a long way off. It takes us 7 or 8 hours to fly there in an airplane. They do that. We don't know how often they do that per year, but at least once a year they go up there. And we think they have to do that to molt, basically. And that pattern has been shown for killer whales in other parts of the Southern Ocean as well. Okay, so this is the toothfish. And I think few people appreciate that this is actually Chilean sea bass, what you might see in Whole Foods until recently. Actually, they're starting to take it off the shelves a little bit. And the toothfish is kind of like the equivalent of a shark in the Southern Ocean. There are no sharks. It's too cold for most fish. There's hardly any fish species there, relatively speaking. These fish and the fish that live in the Ross Sea have essentially antifreeze in their blood. Any fish you took out of most of the places around here would actually die instantly if you put them in this water, because it's about -2 degrees, or sorry, like 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're quite large fish, and they are also the subject, unfortunately, from my perspective, of a toothfish fishery, which is managed by an international commission that has a very good record of managing fisheries, mostly around krill in the first place. It's called the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and it's a 24-nation consortium that is consensus-based, and it includes the United States and New Zealand and the United Kingdom and Germany, and also countries like Japan and Korea and China and Russia and the Ukraine. And so there's a lot of conflict right now, a lot of debate about conservation. There's a global agreement to try to protect, I believe it's 10% of the world's ocean by 2020, and this has been rolled back already a few years. It had been set to be happening by, I think, 2012. So we're trying, one of the angles is to try to get all these nations to stick with that commitment. But anyway, this fishery is relatively small by fisheries standards, and but it still amounts to hundreds of thousands of fish being removed. And it's about 3,500 metric tons a year at this point. So when I said Antarctica is pristine, that's what I used to think about Antarctica, and then I started learning more about this. So there's also been whaling, not quite all the way into the Ross Sea, but whaling has been a factor. So in the context of all these things and the idea of a base datum of normality, we had this idea of an intact ecosystem. You know, this is a simplified version of it, basically, but we had that notion of this incredible primary production. How could that be that there'd be so many diatoms in this place? And usually what you would tend to think is that the diatoms must not be getting grazed. They're not getting eaten by something, and that must be what's going on. So the things that eat diatoms are primarily these krill, the crystal krill, that a lot of these predators eat. So we think the krill numbers must be lower than expected, but they're still high enough to sustain all these predators. So we think that this system actually has been largely in balance, that there's large numbers of predators still in place, and they're keeping these krill numbers down, which is letting that diatom bloom happen. And it's interesting to think if that might have been the situation globally, if there's that much primary production that's actually been removed because of krill surpluses. This is called a krill surplus theory. And the krill surplus theory, by the way, used to be in vogue, and then it went out of vogue, and now I think it's coming back into vogue. It's one of those things. But anyway, so what happens if you start messing with this? This is one of those things that ecologists are always worrying about, right? What do you do if you start taking things out? So removing the toothfish clearly has an impact on things that eat toothfish. Weddell seals, particularly when they're pupping, their young seem to, we think, be pretty reliant on Antarctic toothfish. And then those killer whales, we think, specialize on toothfish, so they're probably going to be going down. And then things are able to eat silverfish, maybe they're going to do well, because silverfish are basically the main predator remaining for the krill. So we'll see. The toothfish not being able to eat all the silverfish anymore means that silverfish populations might be going through the roof. So we've been working with other scientists and helping analyze some data sets from all over the place, from lots of different research programs. This one is from a scientific toothfishing toothfish study, looking mostly at that antifreeze stuff and trying to figure out how that worked. But they've been catching Antarctic toothfish since 1971 or something, and really taking good data on it since about 74, 75. And this is what the trend looks like. There's a clear break point in their ability to catch toothfish at this one location near McMurdo Station in the southern Ross Sea. And it happens to coincide very closely with the advent of the toothfish fishery, the industrial toothfish fishery. So that's one coincidence. And then we also have this trend in the number of killer whales that eat the toothfish, which has been declining basically from the beginning of our study onward. So these are just sort of, potentially coincidences, however alarming. And so we've been bringing these to the attention of CAMLR, that fisheries management agency of the 24 nations, and trying to get some concern on their agenda. They came back and basically said, okay, the US delegation to CAMLR said, we'll work with you if you can kind of put together a better picture of what the Ross Sea ecosystem looks like. Where are the conservation hotspots? Where are the places that must be protected? If you had limited money and limited political capital, where would you do this? And this is a theme that comes up, of course, all the time, right? And in fact, a lot of the work that I've been doing with Cornell and Steve Kelling on eBird is really about and the Avian Knowledge Network is really about how do we use these massive data sets that are available showing the distributions of birds really all around the world, but especially in North America, where we have incredible data. We can use those to set conservation priorities, and so that's exciting stuff. So for this particular study, we looked at all the things that ecologists always look at when you're studying a food web and sort of the biology or the ecology of a system. We looked at what the animals, what the species are, and what they eat. Where do they go to forage? And that, in this case, is three-dimensional. It's not just the surface, obviously, but they're also using the depth of the ocean. So it's three-dimensional foraging. And then within that sort of two-dimensional, the surface, how much overlap is there among these animals, where they like to be? Where are they most commonly seen in big numbers and so on? And what are the covariates? What are the environmental variables that predict where they're going to be? So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we ran it all through this algorithm called zonation, which is this nice tool that we have available now that basically can run through all of the observation data combined and allows us to say what happens if we remove different parts of this study area from their potential foraging niche, and if it's not protected, for example, from their foraging space. And basically tries to find the optimal solution for every space that's removed. Where's the remaining best places? So from that, you create a continuous surface where you can see the absolute most important place, and then the next most important place, and the next most important place in a continuum. So I'll get to that at the end. So we had basically cruise data from 12 different cruises that started in 1976 and were done every few years between then and about 1999. And 40 different investigators contributed data to this. These are just examples of some of the types of data that went into it. We collected data basically on everything that was observable from the ships. So the Minke whales on the left, where they were seen. We had basically mostly just presence-absence data that we could use. In some cases, we had numbers. The snow petrels in the middle. Snow petrels are one of the most common bird species in this area. And then for Weddell seals are a little different than the other species because they, in summertime, are basically tied to their pups. So they stay with their pups in these colonies on the fast ice. But then in the wintertime, they go out, and they're one of the only top predators in the whole system that can be there in the wintertime. Because this is all ice in the wintertime, so they can actually chew their way through ice to get into the water. So then we found 6 environmental variables that we thought might help explain why the animals are where they are after going through all the different things we could possibly collect data on. And this turned out to be the depth of the ocean, the prevalence of this type of water called circumpolar deep water, which is high salinity, slightly warmer water that we think drives production in some ways. Summer sea ice and also winter sea ice for the Weddell seals. So it's the mean percent cover during the summer. And then the chlorophyll content that I was talking about, that primary production value. The distance to that shelf break where the deep water starts. And then the angle of that slope, or the slope of the bottom. In some places those troughs have really steep slopes, so it's the gradient, how much of a drop-off there is. And so we found that in the diet composition, as I was alluding, there's basically not that much to eat there other than these 2 species which occur in vast quantities. So they mostly eat silverfish and krill, or silverfish or krill. There aren't that many options. So it's a really kind of a basic thing, and clearly silverfish and krill are keystone. If you removed one of those from the system, it'd be a big deal. And people are really worrying about krill generally in the Southern Ocean. That's been a big concern for a long time. Silverfish, so far, knock on wood, no one's decided to target as a prey species for humans, but I would look for that to be happening at some point. And then the foraging depth, turns out actually they're fairly broadly distributed. So that's one way that they don't get in each other's way. So then this question is like, how can there be hundreds of thousands of large predators eating really even more hundreds of thousands of tons of food and not be in each other's way all the time and not totally deplete the system? Well, one of the answers is they distribute their niches vertically. So they occupy different spaces vertically in this system. And they also have low spatial overlap. So across the XY coordinate field, they're not in the same place at the same time. They're pretty well distributed across the whole Ross Sea. However, what's interesting in the environmental niche, that sort of relationship between where they're likely to be and those covariates that I mentioned are very similar, really surprisingly similar. So they're looking for the same kinds of things, but they're looking for it in different places. So there's this really neat thing going on where they're actually really distributed across the entire system. And the thing that's most important for most of the species is this variable. This just lists all the different variables that we looked at: the chlorophyll, the bathymetry, the sea ice cover, the presence of circumpolar deep water, the distance to the shelf break front, and the bathymetric gradient, that's steepness of the depth change. And the distance to the shelf break slope front is by far the most driving factor in these models. So basically what that means is that that shelf front is highly productive, which is not a big surprise to most people who study oceanography. But there's a little more to it. There's different patterns of use of the habitat. So I'm going to show you a series of maps that look like this. So I'll just take a little time to explain what the colors mean. This is basically a habitat suitability map where the darker blues and greens reflect high suitability for the species, in this case light-mantled sooty albatross. And the Ross Sea is down here. Here's the Ross Ice Shelf and Ross Island. And here's that shelf break slope, the shelf area, the front area. And you can see there's very little encroachment of the albatrosses onto the shelf itself. So this is the kind of odd duck, if you will. They tend to like it offshore. They're not an ice-loving species, really. They're one of the southernmost albatrosses, but albatrosses don't cross the ice field. Then you have these animals that are really able to basically use the entire shelf and the slope itself. And that's the killer whale, type C killer whale, or the Ross Sea killer whale, and the Weddell seal in wintertime. And then the most common sort of pattern that we saw was this thing that we call the marginal ice zone preference, which is the area around that polynya where there's pack ice, but it's pretty loose pack ice, and the animals have access to open water all the time. So all the rest of the species basically follow that pattern of distribution. The minke whales, crab-eater seals, Antarctic petrels, and snow petrels, as well as the 2 penguin species, Adele penguins and emperor penguins. So what we did then was we took all of these types of maps that we made and kind of, if you will, layered them into the zonation software that I was talking about. That enables us to calculate in a couple different ways where the conservation priorities are. That was our original quest for all this, if you'll remember, trying to help CAMLR defend and the US delegation in particular, defend a marine protected area proposal. And so you come up with these two options, or there's actually other ways of looking at it, of course, as well. The one on the left is just straight species richness. Where are the places where you will see the most species? And if you've been paying close attention, you'll remember that I said they're spread all over the place, and it actually doesn't really reveal much of a pattern. There are a couple of hotspot areas. This area is called the Island Bank area, and out here in this area looks a little bit richer. But really, these aren't big differences. Not that informative. Really, the zonation conservation ranking on the right side is more informative, and it contains more ability for us to actually parse the data and do exercises where we can say, okay, are you going to try to protect 90%? Are you going to try to protect 95%? We're hoping for as much as we can of the highest priority places. And so we can draw different boundaries on the basis of those percentiles that we can set as targets. So it turned out that this is actually really condensing a lot of politics that went on behind the scenes, as you can probably imagine, trying to get towards consensus. And consensus was shot down in Bremerhaven in August. And was that August? I think so. There was a special meeting of CAMLR to try to agree on this marine protected area. And basically, we got 22 and a half, maybe 23 votes, and then Russia said no. But they said no on the basis of some technicalities. But they did complain that we were asking for too much. And actually, the original proposal did ask for a lot more than we had science to back up, in a sense. The first proposal included a lot of stuff up in this area in deep water that there really aren't a lot. There wasn't a lot going on in our data either. And the Russians actually used that as an excuse in a way to say, well, maybe you guys didn't really use science to come up with these lines. And that was an interesting critique, I thought. It's like, okay. Anyway, and I didn't have anything to do with this most recent version other than we did provide that data set. And it does look a lot like the original boundaries that we had agreed on. There's a little bit more going on here. They went with the Blaney Island protection as well as a little bit more north here. And they went for a set of seamounts out here. And unfortunately, they didn't protect part of the Island Bank area. That is one of the best areas. It's also the place where they catch almost all the toothfish. So there's a lot of politics behind the scene. But if we got this, I think it would be a huge success. So I'm hoping that will actually happen. And that's going to be decided in October, actually. So towards the end of October, we'll find out where we're at. So just to summarize, almost all species like that shelf slope area, that shelf break area. The diet composition and environmental niches overlapped extensively, so they're occupying that same environmental space, but not the same physical space. Not because of the depth partitioning and also because of the horizontal space. They use the entire area. Those deep troughs as well turned up as important. So they like those areas of high bathymetric relief, high change, like where there's shallow water near deep water and a lot of change. And our conservation ranking system is being used by CAMLR, I think. It looks like it is. And hopefully we'll get protection here at the end of October. Thank you. And I have no idea how long I just talked for, so I probably have a little time for questions at least.
Yeah, we've got time for questions, and I'm going to ask Grant to please repeat the question.
Okay, I'll try to remember, and if I forget, which I might, please remind me. Thank you. Yes?
I have two questions. One is concerning the boundaries, and you mentioned Russia not wanting to agree. What are the countries involved? Like, especially that area where you say there's the toothfish. I mean, if you lose that area and there's fishing there, then that's going to create a huge imbalance. If you could speak more about that. And then the other question is sort of a little very different, but since you work out in California, I'm very concerned with the Fukushima plant, and I'm very concerned about radiation going into the ocean. And is it in the sea life? Is it reaching the United States? Or what is the radiation doing? Because we don't hear any information about that. I know it's a different thing, but I was wondering if you could talk about that too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so 2 questions. First one is about Russia and their opposition and the fishing that's happening in that one place that was excluded from both proposals, and whether that's going to cause problems. And it's not ideal from a conservation perspective or from an ecological perspective. However, it is, it's, from the perspective of the fishing people who have, definitely have a voice in this, it's sort of a non-negotiable. The good news about it is that it limits where the boats go, so they're not all over the place. One of the problems with fishing there is that it's extremely likely to result in fuel spills and sunken boats. It already is there's a lot of accidents because the boats run into ice and stuff like that. So one thing is that it's safer, more concentrated in one spot, more easily monitored. And there is a control area next to it that they set up, that's extra area, which I'll show here. This special research zone is what that is. It's right adjacent to that hotspot. The SRZ is actually another hotspot. It's a place where it's almost as good, if you will, in terms of the number of fish. So there's this idea that there's going to be a study of the effect of the fishing and to try to get a better idea of what the impact of the fishing is. So hopefully, we'll be able to actually manage that fishery using that information. That's the idea of it. I'll leave it at that. With regards to Fukushima and the impact, the question was, are there impacts of Fukushima being seen in the animals and in the ocean off California or the United States? And as to my knowledge, no one has reported any evidence of high levels or of suspiciously high levels of radiation in the ecosystem yet. There have been some concerns recently that it's actually yet to arrive. So it's yet to arrive. It hasn't gotten there yet. And there's been more radiation, we believe, leaked than had originally been announced. So it's definitely still a concern. There's definitely people looking at it, and there's various interesting studies being done. There's some more. There's a beach walk program out there that people are looking for dead animals, but also debris from Fukushima, and they did find a lot of sort of tidal detritus, things that had sort of been released by the tidal wave that had made it already across the surface. But so far, as far as I know, no radiation. So
I heard that the tuna has a high level of radiation.
I haven't heard that, but it's possible. Yes?
2 questions. One quick. Any relation to Bob?
No. No.
Okay. The second question on this sea ice season getting longer. Is there any historical data on the length of that goes back to see if it's part of a natural cycle?
Right. It's really kind of hard to say, and there is data. The data are a lot of it's from diatoms and foraminifera in the cores from the sea sediment below where there had been ice or hadn't been ice, and the problem is that there have been extensive glaciation. So it depends on how far back you go, but certainly in the last 10,000 years, we don't think there's been periods of more sea ice than this. Maybe it was equivalent at the end, near the end of that, the beginning of that 10,000 year ago period. We know that the penguins have been occupying these places off and on for at least 50,000 years, 45,000 years. So there has been definitely variation in the system. If there were penguins there before the last glacial period, then certainly there was sea ice, and I would imagine there was periods of extensive sea ice around those glaciations, but caused by different things. So I guess I would assume that there has been a lot of sea ice in the past at different times. Yeah. Yeah, Gabe.
So
sort of a follow-up. Early on, you showed on the peninsula that the sea ice season was shorter and then it's longer in the Ross Sea.
Right.
How far apart are those, and what's the relationship between those?
Right. So the question is, I showed earlier that the sea ice season is growing in length in the Ross Sea and shortening in length in the Antarctic Peninsula. And is there a connection? Is that some sort of dipole, for example, some kind of balance? And in a way, yes. There's a thing called the southern annular mode, which is sort of like El Nino kind of thing, where you have a pressure difference between two places that's measured in the Southern Ocean, and that has been stuck, if you will, in one mode or the other, negative or positive mode. I think it's a negative mode, and that tends to cause a set of weather patterns that promotes windier conditions in the Ross Sea, which is what's contributing a lot to that sea ice field growing. So in a sense, yes, yeah. Not clear. The climate models that predict ice field generation in the Southern Ocean there are not very many that actually get it right. But the ones that do, we're definitely looking at more closely to try to understand how much it has to do with that southern annular mode. Anyone else? Yes?
You're talking about the area of the sea ice. Is there any study on whether the depth is any shallower than it used to be?
Yeah, people do look at the depth, and I'm not as familiar with the details of it, but I believe that the depth and the extent tend to correlate, and that's been the case. But it certainly is a major factor. In some places, that certainly has been that you could have really thin ice or annual ice and not multi-year ice, and that's a major factor. And it does vary a lot. We've had a period recently of multi-year ice that just finally broke out, fast ice that grew and grew and grew, and so it got really thick, and has been now it's a pretty dominant feature in the Ross Sea, and I think that's kind of unusual. I think it's generally more, at least in the past few decades, has been more annual ice. Yes.
I don't think that you mentioned with the variation that you began with of the periods when the sea ice that was, it almost sounds like a season was
Yeah.
a big block. You didn't mention really how the penguins were reacting to that, which I'm assuming means that they're fine.
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for reminding me to talk about that. The question is, I showed some information about the sea ice season actually looking like it might be better possibly for penguins in the Ross Sea area. And why didn't I talk about what the penguins are doing? So in fact, the penguins are doing better in the Ross Sea area, and it might be because of the sea ice. They certainly don't like fast ice very much, and we did have a phase where there was a lot of fast ice, in part because of these giant icebergs that came along and changed ocean currents and circulation, and basically enabled a whole bunch of fast ice to form for several years, which was what led to that thick ice that I was talking about just now. But once that all breaks up, it tends to be good. And anyway, the penguins have been, in fact, one of the main reasons that we're studying the system is trying to understand why those populations were growing so fast. They grew very quickly in the 80s, and it's complete opposite to what was happening in the peninsula area, where the penguin populations are basically, Adele penguin populations are disappearing and being replaced by more warm water, less ice-loving species like chinstraps and gentoos. So we thought maybe it's about ice. Then we started thinking about whaling and fishing, and we're not so sure it's just ice. I think probably it's a combination of things, but the removal of all the whales in the 80s, the Japanese took a lot of whales in the 80s, and then it actually slowed down and got a little bit more under control. It's still happening, but it's not as bad as it was. Again, a major competitor of penguins, of the Adele penguin. So the removal of really, I think it was, I don't even know, it was tens of thousands of Minke whales. It was something like 1,000 a year for a while, and even more than that at some point, I think. Had to affect the ecosystem. And even though it wasn't down in the Ross Sea itself, like not over the shelf, it was still in the area where the Adele penguins spend the winter. So there's certainly a potential for a release of krill and silverfish from the removal of those Minke whales that the Adeles could have responded to in a positive way. And similarly with toothfish now, the whaling kind of slowed down, but the toothfish industry has picked up, and is really would be predicted to have, or could be predicted to have the same effect. Yes, Fitz?
So as a follow-up on that toothfish, it's a non-negotiable deal out there where the prime toothfish spot is. On the other hand, you guys, through a bunch of years, decades of work, can show an absolutely unambiguous steep population decline once the fishery begins. What are the conversations like with the, I guess, Russians or others, when you're presenting them the data, they can't argue with, and saying, do you want to take them right down to zero, or shouldn't we, we've got a gas gauge here. Why don't we let up on it and let the things recover? What are the conversations like in that context?
Okay, so the question is, I talked about that toothfish fishery hotspot that's not getting protected. It's not in the proposal at the moment, and how that might be non-negotiable. But what about those unambiguous signals of the ecosystem that seem to be unambiguous? They seem to show clearly that that the ecosystem is responding to the fishing. And what are those conversations like? So conversations are interesting. They tend to go something like this. Well, the killer whales are probably going somewhere else, and they'll be fine. Or the toothfish really responded to that weird iceberg thing that happened right around the same time that the fishing started. And that's kind of like a once in 500-year event, so could have been correlated with that just as well as anything else. So these are correlative studies, and as you probably know, correlation does not indicate causation. They are asking us, and this is a frustration, but it's starting to make me laugh because I'm kind of, I don't know, getting jaded or something, but basically the gold standard of science is to make a hypothesis and do an experiment and show that you were able to predict what was going to happen or not.
And the experiment would be try a moratorium for 5 years.
Exactly. But the problem is that we need them to do it probably for more than 5 years. But we have said 5 years, and we have said 30 years, which would be better. And so those conversations are happening. At the same time, there really is, that's not actually the problem. You get further when you talk about the aesthetic and cultural value and the idea of wilderness. That goes further, even with the people that are dead set against doing anything differently or just listening to what a few fishermen really want. When we talk about the beauty of the place and the majesty of the place, and isn't it special that we have this pristine, amazing thing in the world, and then popular opinion starts shifting in these countries, which it does, then they start paying attention. And that's actually been at least equally effective, if not more so in some countries. So we have to not forget that. You can do all the science. So anyway, I was going to say that the burden of proof really shouldn't be on our side. It should be on their side. And that's the way CAMELR was actually formed in the first place, was that they were supposed to set quotas on the basis of science. And they were supposed to prove that they're not having an effect. But that somewhere in the last 30 years, it's flipped. Ken?
All right, so a big picture question. We hear a lot about the rapid loss of polar ice in the Arctic, and the models, seem to be predicting horrible stuff going on up there. Yet what you're showing seems to be, there's some things going on, but it seems like the system and the penguins are doing fairly well, and you're not really sounding any big alarms from what I've heard. So I'm just wondering what you think overall. Are there models predicting, the collapse of that ecosystem, and are you really worried about what's going on in Antarctica? Is it going to happen at some point, or are you thinking that it's not as dire?
Okay, the question is, the Arctic, we know, has lost 50% of its ice in the sea ice extent in the last, it might even be volume to get at that 3D question, the depth, the thickness, but in the last 30 years. Actually, I think it's even less than that. Last 20 years, we've lost 50% of the Arctic ice. Antarctic Peninsula, similar story, but Ross Sea, not so much. It's going the other way right now. But the models predict, and there has been some modeling of this, that system will start shifting within as soon as 20 years, and that was a few years ago, so 17 years or something. And then maybe it's 40 years, but somewhere within a few decades we expect it to change. Yeah. Yes?
The oil exploration the Russians are doing right now, is that influenced at all, or does this show any of that influence?
Most of the oil exploration is happening in the north, although there is possibly, we're not sure exactly what they're up to, but there is the idea of oil exploration in the south, although it's banned. There's no extraction permitted by international treaty that they have signed. So at this point, there's no risk, of that. But that treaty is just a treaty. They've been subject to change in the past. So that's something to keep an eye on. But right now in the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean, it's not a pressing issue that I know of.
Getting back to the toothfish, I don't know if I missed this in your talk, but why is the toothfish so important to the Russians?
Okay, that's a great question. Why is the toothfish important to the Russians? The Russians, in fact, don't actually catch toothfish. So this is a really interesting part of this. They're against this on principle. So it's hard to say exactly what's going on. If you take them at face value, like I said, they raised some scientific concerns that were, I don't know, I didn't think they were that solid, but they were at least, aware of some of the factors that we had raised, for sure. And they have done, good science in the Southern Ocean. But I think that it's more not just not wanting to be pushed around by the rest of the world, and it's just there is this attitude, it's similar to United Nations kind of thing, where right now that's their power, has been their power, is that veto option. They've been pushing back on the idea of CAMLR having the so-called right to even establish this sort of a regulation. They question the legality of all that, which, it's a strange time to be bringing that up, really. They've been agreeing to it for a long time now, but now, in this particular case, so it's hard to say. That was a good question, thank you. Yes?
Who catches the most toothfish?
The question is, who catches the most toothfish? Does anyone want to guess?
Japan.
Iceland.
I think I might have heard it. New Zealand catches the most. They have the easiest access, and this is another part of this puzzle. New Zealand is the closest country, and they have the ability to get 2 ships down there, and they can do it twice a year if they're really efficient. So they always catch their quota for sure, and it's an interesting thing because New Zealand also has this huge tourist industry around being green and progressive, and that's been called into question over this issue, and there's talk about public opinion mattering. That's a place where it really makes a difference. So that's definitely an approach that we're trying, is to, we have a documentary called The Last Ocean that has been shown in every movie theater in New Zealand.
Do they export it?
Yeah, then they export it to us, and we buy it, and we think we're buying Chilean sea bass. Exactly, right. Yeah, yes.
It's on the protected list, on that Monterey Bay list, what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the Monterey Aquarium has a seafood watch list and an app for your phone, which, I generally think is a good thing. But so the question is, isn't it on the protected list or the do not eat list? It's not actually. It's on the yellow. It's got yellow status, which used to be called. What would it say? Proceed with caution is what it said. That's what it used to say. Now it says good alternative. But it's still the same criteria. They just changed the marketing of it. So it's one of those things, and I talked to them about that. Can't we change this to proceed with caution? That sounds a little bit better from my perspective than good alternative, So if you actually read what they say on their write-up, which I encourage you all to do, and send your comments to them, it's very nuanced, and it's actually, you realize that there's no way a consumer could actually be informed enough to make a decision on the basis of what they're reading there. It basically says, some ships fishing in the Ross Sea are doing it in a responsible way. Something like that is basically what it says. So, okay, maybe they are, but you know, there's other ones fishing there too. Which ones are we eating? Yep.
How will the MPA be enforced, and are contaminants problem with that?
Okay, the question is, how will the MPA be enforced? And are contaminants a problem in this food web? Thank you. We don't know how the MPA will be enforced. Other than, that's one argument for keeping fishing going, is that the people who are permitted to be there and have done all the things that they need to do, which is expensive. You have to have observers on board. You have to maintain a certain ideal level for your ship, and it has to be of a certain type and all these things. That's a major investment for a company. When they're there, they don't want to see illegal operations happening because it impacts them. They often get called in to rescue boats that are below standard and things like that. So that there is a real role that the legitimate fishers play in that sense, and monitoring. New Zealand and Australia both do a lot of monitoring as well. New Zealand in particular over the Ross Sea area, they fly an airplane, and they are pretty aware of what vessels are there. It's a big area, and it's hard to get in there and out of there without being noticed. There's also satellite tracking of ships, and that's getting more and more sophisticated. There's still, for sure, illegal fishing, and that's a major concern, not just in the Ross Sea. As far as contaminants go, it's one of the least polluted places in the world. It's very hard to detect any contaminants whatsoever. There's been a lot of effort to try to detect various contaminants, and not much has turned up. So it's pretty amazing that way. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Jesse.
Hey, Grant, I just have a quick question because I remember you talking about this in the past as well. And I was wondering, as general public, what would you recommend other than us not eating Chilean sea bass or toothfish? What can we do?
Okay, great question. What can you do about this issue and supporting the MPA and the general public? And it is more than just not buying Chilean sea bass. It's actually starting that dialogue with all of your fishmongers, wherever you buy your fish, raising the issue with them and saying, you know, if they're selling it, or if they're selling anything really that seems unsustainable, tell them that you care. They really do pay attention, and that's the strongest vote we have, is with our pocketbooks. It makes a huge difference, and we have changed. Safeway was one of the first to change. Wegmans went over to our side. Kmart changed over. So it's really kind of amazing to me that can happen, and it doesn't actually take a lot. You just have to give them the information, and if you need help finding the information, let me know and I can help you. You can go to the Last Ocean. I think I have that on here, the website. lastocean.co.nz is a good place to get information. There's a lot of other things you can do, and it mostly then starts becoming trying to get in contact with representatives, particularly for New Zealand and the United States. But I've heard that actually, like China and Korea, I went over there and talked with some of their representatives to Camelot, their delegates, and they seem to care that what the American public thinks of it all. But really, as long as there's a market in America and in Europe, you know, it's really kind of hypocritical of us to say, yeah, you can't fish there. All right, thank you very much, everyone.